Hello and welcome to This Week in X, presented by Crushing Comics. I'm your host, Peter, and we are here to talk about all of Marvel Comics' X-Men books out on Wednesday, September 19th. There are 4 X-Men titles out this week: Mr. and Mrs. X, Multiple Man, The Return of Wolverine, and X-Men Gold. Now, what I'm going to do in this program is I'm not going to just recap the books for you, because the point is you might want to read them and enjoy them yourself. And I'm not just going to review them, because what if you don't know me? You don't know if my reviews count for anything for you, and even if you do know me, you might not agree. And it's not just a reaction either. It's a little bit of all of those things bundled up with some history of how we got to these books and what you need to be grounded in to appreciate them the most, even if I maybe didn't appreciate them that much. So we're going to dig into each of these books in alphabetical order this week, plus I'll touch on any new X-Men collections out this week at the end. Ready? Let's dive in. Mr. and Mrs. X, which is really just kind of a code name for saying Gambit and Rogue, issue number 3, was written by Kelly Thompson with art from Oscar Bazaldua, color art from Frank Dermata, letters from Joe Sabino, cover by Terry Dodson and Rachel Dodson, and it was edited by Annalise Biza, Darren Shan, and X-Men line editor Jordan White. This has been a really fun series for me for a lot of different reasons, not the least of which that I love Rogue and Gambit. But I think in order to catch you up on this, there's a lot more that you need to be aware of than just the 2 issues that came before. Maybe we'll start with the most current things to be aware of and kind of work our way back. So the most current thing to be aware of is what's going on in this series. Gambit and Rogue are trying to go on a honeymoon, and they decided, per Gambit, that that honeymoon would be in space. Easy way to get away from all of the terrestrial worries of the X-Men, right? Well, it turns out that they wind up running into some problems and familiar faces in space, and wind up tasked by Kitty Pryde to handle a mission while they are on their honeymoon. Of course, the next question is, why are they on their honeymoon? Because Gambit and Rogue took over Kitty Pryde and Colossus's wedding in X-Men Gold number 30, because Kitty Pryde and Colossus never quite made it all the way to the final I do. Now, you might be saying, whoa, Gambit and Rogue got married? That seems pretty stunning. Well, not if you had read the Gambit and Rogue, or is it Rogue and Gambit, miniseries from early in 2018, written by Kelly Thompson, also the writer of this title, which saw Kitty send them on a mission where they had to pretend to be a couple. And in pretending to be a couple, they really revisited some of the greatest hits of their continuity and worked out some of the things that had been keeping them apart from each other, because they haven't really been a couple on page for the better part of a decade in X-Men comic books. But it's the things that Kelly Thompson really focused on in that series that have come to bear fruit in this series. It's very much just like the prologue or volume O of Mr. and Mrs. X. We just didn't know it at the time. We were like, ooh, a treat, Gambit and Rogue in a miniseries. And what I mean by that is that this is drawing heavily on Chris Claremont era X-Men, and I'm going to have to spoil a little bit of the plot of it to tell you about that. But everything from Gambit and Rogue's relationship, which really had just been a first meeting by that era of X-Men, and then all of the background we're seeing here. They're coming up against the Shi'ar Imperial Guard, which of course we know originally from the Dark Phoenix saga, although there's been many iterations of them over the years. Gladiator, their traditional leader, is actually now the Imperator of the Shi'ar Galactic Empire after all the events of War of Kings and Realm of Kings, which are awesome. Highly recommended comic books. So it doesn't really matter if you know who the Shi'ar Guard are or aren't. They pretty much get replaced. Like, each of them is a role or an archetype, and they do get replaced over time, so it doesn't really matter. And they're not really too heavily in this issue, but they do appear. There's also TechNet, who doesn't appear in this issue, but appeared in a previous one. They are a Alan Davis and I guess Alan Moore creation that wound up graduating from Captain Britain into Chris Claremont and Alan Davis's Excalibur. Also from Alan Davis's Excalibur is Cerise, who is a Shi'ar character who briefly was a member of the Excalibur team and that we haven't seen for a long time, and who I love. And so she is appearing in this comic book too. But here's the real doozy. You may recall that Professor X over time had a romantic relationship with Lilandra, who was the Empress of the Shi'ar Empire, and ultimately pretty much runs away with her in his cloned body at the end of X-Men 200, Uncanny X-Men 200, and he's gone for a really, really long time, pretty much until the very end of Claremont's run around 275. Now, they still have their relationship after he returns, although ultimately they kind of of go to war with each other in Grant Morrison's new X-Men. But what this comic supposes, and last stop to get off for spoilers, is that the Shi'ar Empire had their genetic information all along, and they've combined their genetic information to engineer an egg that is their offspring. Now, that's just not some crazy thing. Shi'ar do give birth with eggs. And so that's what Kitty has tasked Gambit and Rogue to go and rescue. And in this issue, we see that the egg has hatched. And what is inside of it? Well, we were led to believe at the end of the last issue that it was Rogue, which is crazy because we're with Rogue, but you never know in comic books. But in this issue, we kind of learn all that stuff about it being their combined offspring via a hilarious sequence where Kitty and Rogue are kind of screaming at each other on the TV screens or the video screens in the spaceship, while Gambit and Deadpool chase around this young birthed creation in the background. Yes, Deadpool's in this comic book too, but it's not as hit you over the head with Deadpool as a lot of Deadpool appearances. Deadpool and Rogue were teammates in Uncanny Avengers pretty recently and did share a kiss, and more than just a kiss, like an actual kind of ongoing emotional reckoning that makes them kind of make sense as friends, if not a couple. And Deadpool's used really well here. So I think that's all the information you need to know, although there's certainly a lot more of information in Gambit and Rogue's past. But if you knew all of that, this comic, I think, would really hit for you. It really does hit for me. And I think a big part of that is because I share so many of those favorite stories and influences with Kelly Thompson. We're at a point now that for those of us who are in our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, still reading comic books, there are writers who've come up reading the things that we've been fans of and are now writing with those things in mind. And it's a really fun experience. I think Kelly Thompson might be around my age, but she clearly has read a lot of the same comic books that I read from the 1990s, and so this pushes my buttons. And if you listen to that whole summary of things and you were like, I've never read that, I didn't know about that, well, maybe you might like it, but you might actually just want to go back and read some of those classic old stories so that you might appreciate this one a little bit more. But I will say that this is not just a pastiche of continuity button pressing that's making this comic feel so good to me. I think part of it too, well, a couple of things. I think Kelly Thompson writes Rogue and Gambit in a way that they aren't skeevy. There's always like a weird kind of emotional abuse going back and forth between them because Gambit thought he could have anything and Rogue thought she was safe because she couldn't be touched. And it was actually written so long in so many instances in a really kind of gross way that was hard to read as totally romantic. Don't at me if you don't agree. This is just my personal opinion on it. But whether or not you share that opinion, Thompson has kind of given them a veneer of mutual respect and long-term friendship instead of just driving their whole relationship via them flirting back and forth in a way that might never be consummated. And through that, I actually just feel so much heart and love between them and for them as characters. So that's one thing in its favor. The other thing is, and this has been coming up a lot lately in social media circles, and I'm glad to see it, is Kelly Thompson might secretly be one of the best action writers in Marvel's entire writer lineup right now. Maybe not so secretly now that we're all talking about it. She has, for series after series, come up with these really inventive action beats. She did it in Kate Bishop as Hawkeye. She did it in Rogue and Gambit's miniseries. This issue has a ridiculous sequence where Gambit and Deadpool are fighting their way across a page in 2-layer stacks per page on a 2-page spread, and there's 2 of the 2-page spreads, so it's like a 4-page action spread, and it's really inventive. It shows a ton of motion, and all credit to artist Oscar Bazaldua for that, but also it's totally emblematic of Thompson's approach to action all the time. I've poked her about it on social media, and she's very, very kind in crediting all of her artists, but she also says she's a huge fan of action movies, and she tries to bring that love to the page. Well, I think she's succeeded. So, you know, you have a book that has a lot of the heart of 2 characters we like, that is drenched in continuity stretching back over 30 years, and that also writes really great, punchy, compact action, and that's also, like, just amusing, fun to read. And you get a book that's really satisfying. So the question becomes, should you pick this up? I think I've outlined a lot of reasons that you should, but all of us in our minds know that Uncanny X-Men, the relaunch, is looming in November. And so you might be saying, is this Shi'ar egg one of these things that's going to have a bearing on the relaunch? Well, also this week in kind of like comic Twitter, social media news, Kelly Thompson mentioned that Rogue and Gambit are not going to feature super heavily in that Uncanny X-Men relaunch because they have their own thing happening that will begin in the 2nd arc of this title. So this is an X-Men book that you can very safely be reading on its own. Even though I told you it relies on all this stuff, and I told you if you don't know the stuff, maybe you don't want to pick it up, but if you're familiar with that stuff, if you like Rogue and Gambit, if you like Kelly Thompson, if you want to be reading an X-Men book that you can kind of just enjoy in its own silo, it really feels like this might be that book. So I have nothing but positive things to say about it. I think the script, art, everything about it is terrific. This issue's a little bit lighter weight in feel than the last two, which felt like they had a little bit more content both in plot development and in the fights, but it's fun and it leaves Rogue and Gambit in a very interesting predicament. So big endorsement from me for this new issue of Mr. and Mrs. X. Multiple Man, issue number 4 of 5, was written by Matthew Rosenberg, with art from Andy McDowell, color art from Tamara Bonvillain, letters from Travis Lanham, and a cover from Marcos Martin. It was edited by Christina Harrington and Jordan White. I have been saving myself for this week to binge read all of Multiple Man, so I'd be ready to talk to you, and oh boy, maybe that was a mistake, because I think I built it up a lot, and now you're going to hear me complain a little bit. But to be fair, I probably was going to complain about this series and this issue no matter what. And before I give you all the background, let me set up what that is so you can know if you just want to fast forward right past this, okay? I think we as comic book fans, but especially we as X-Men fans who are reading what is truly one of the longest running and densest soap opera type serialized stories existing on the planet, with one of the biggest casts and with the most continuity involved, I think that we sometimes ask for this thing that we don't really want or need. And that is, we ask for issues that show things that really could easily be implied. Like, somebody's time-lost daughter comes back to the present and we're like, well, we didn't see the scene where they first saw each other. And we know intuitively as readers that that's going to be emotional, but we just think that it's going to be emotional and important. And sometimes there's really nothing to write other than the hug, you know? And we like to see the hug because we're invested in the characters, but we don't need to see the hug. And we do that a lot. There's this idea that's being attacked right now of plot holes. Like, is it something a plot hole just because it's not shown? It's really only a plot hole if it just does not make sense and there's no way that you can possibly connect it. Something not being shown is not plot hole. That is just the shorthand of serialized or non-serialized storytelling. I say all that because this issue is very much an issue for those people who said, I really wish we could have seen blank. Because what it does is fill in a huge amount of things that were happening in the background in the first 2 issues of this series without really taking us anywhere new. Well, now I've got to explain the series and the first 2 issues. So Madrox, the Multiple Man, he was a very, very minor X-Men character for a long time. He popped up, I think, originally in a Fantastic Four annual, I want to say, and then he was kind of in the deep background on Muir Island during Chris Claremont's run there. He eventually kind of got made a part of the Muir Island X-Men team in the mid-50s of Uncanny, so he's part of the Muir Island saga, the big showdown with the Shadow King at the end of Chris Claremont's original run. But the way we really all know him, I mean, people read him and remember him from back then, but that's not how we know him. We know him because he was in Peter David's original run of X Factor, the all-new, all-different X Factor that debuted as a team in X Factor 71 in 1991. That was the team with Havoc, Polaris, Wolfsbane, Strong Guy, Quicksilver, and Multiple Man. So he, in that run, was very much the heart of the book. He was a goof, as also was Strong Guy, and they were sort of a goofy, odd couple together. And his power was a really unusual power that allowed for a lot of visual gags. But one of the gags that kind of got attached to Madrox was that he tends to die. Because, well, I guess, have I even explained his power? His power is that on any physical impact, he can create a duplicate of himself. But it's not an exact duplicate, even though it's genetically his clone. It tends to have an aspect of his personality. We've seen him spin off duplicates that have gone on to be scientists, lawyers, priests, all sorts of things, but they're all Jamie Madrox. And pretty early in that X Factor run, although pretty much at the end of Peter David's time on it, we see him die as a result of the legacy virus. And, well, actually, maybe he dies after Peter David leaves, but that's beside the point. And so we really think he's dead, and then later we find out he's alive because there was like a dupe who died, or he wasn't Madrox Prime, or they were all dupes all along, and Madrox Prime was secreted away somewhere, something like that, right? It doesn't really matter. But it introduces the idea that he is multiplicity. There's no possible way that we know where every one of him is, and there's no possible way to know that he has definitively died. Now, Peter David gets to play a lot more with him in X Factor Investigations, which started with a Madrox miniseries, and then X Factor came out of that in 2006 and ran a long time, I think over 100 issues with Peter David writing, and there's a lot of great Madrox material in that, and it ended with a seemingly happy ending of him going off to the sunset with Layla Miller, which is a little bit creepy because he first met her as a preteen, but then she got older, so I guess it's okay. Or not, we're not here to comment on that. But then, unfortunately, Madrox was used as kind of early cannon fodder in Inhumans vs. X-Men. The team gets to Muir Island and they see this landscape of dead Madroxes, you know, strewn across the island. And of course, we were all really upset about that as X-Men fans, because X-Men fans tend to be pretty positive on him. He's a swell guy. But in the back of our minds, we're all thinking, well, we've all seen him die before, and we've seen him die of a virus before. So just because we see dozens or hundreds of dupes dead here on the island, it really doesn't mean anything, right? Like, he could be anywhere. There could be a dupe secreted away. And that is what this series does. But it's not... The dupe that was secreted away isn't necessarily a Madrox Prime. It's just a dupe. And there might have been a reason he was secreted away. And he seems really keen to want to kind of become Prime. He's like, well, I'm going to be the main Madrox now, if in fact the main Madrox died. But in the process of doing that and kind of being spirited to the X-Mansion to talk to Beast, our very ethically challenges super scientist about that, he gets a hold of a time travel device and he bips into the future and then bips back. And that creates a whole lot of drama because he creates dupes in the future, and then the future dupes come back, and they have all crazy superpowers. There's a Doctor Strange dupe, there's a Hulk dupe, there's a Deadpool dupe, and so they're wreaking havoc, and there's another dupe who comes back and tries to fight him and absorbs him, or maybe he absorbed them, and it's a whole thing. Then the issues play out in the future, and we get to see that in some alternate future, and your alarm should be going off right now because we know that I hate some alternate future. Anytime that an X-Men book just invents some new alternate future to give the present day some kind of weight, I immediately am like, deduct 4 points from these possible 5 stars that I'm going to give this comic book. So again, we're working with a natural prejudice of mine here. But he goes to this future, and he discovers that there's a whole horde of multiple men. Multiple men have taken over. Of course, we're also visiting futures recently in X-Men where Ahab has returned from the future, where Magneto is in control of the future. It's just too many darn futures, but whatever. So stuff transpires there. And the whole point of this whole rambling story, which I admit is probably hard to follow from me telling it, which says nothing for how hard to follow it is in the book, is that this issue, all it does is explain how we got all of those superpowered dupes from the future to the present, except it was totally implied. We already saw it implied in the future. He sends off the dupes to get help from these particular heroes, and they did it. Did we need a whole issue following them? It's not that funny, and it doesn't tell us anything we couldn't have already guessed. So it's this whole issue just to replay the things that we've already seen in issues 1 and 2, with knowledge that was already implied, and then that's it. Look, I think it's fine if people like it. I know a lot of swell people who like it. And I think it's fine as a story to be told. I'm never going to say this X-Men comic book shouldn't be, well, I will occasionally say this X-Men comic book shouldn't be written, but I'm not saying that either. I'm just saying, if you're going to go through all this trouble to make an alternate future with this character who can make infinite copies of himself, almost, and that's how you're going to give weight to the present day, don't rob our present day of weight by just dallying in the future moment again and again. Give us something we can feel, right? So that's where I am on this Multi-Mill Man comic book. I can't recommend it to longtime X Factor fans. It doesn't have that feel. I can't recommend it to Jamie Madrox fans because it's not the Jamie we really know. And it's funny and acerbic, and it does work in Layla Miller in the future, but it's not really rewarding if you're a big Madrox fan. And I can't really recommend it to X-Men fans either, because with one issue left, either he's going to tie this whole time thing up in a bow, or we're going to get this horde of Madrox duplicates in the present trying to take over. I mean, those are the things that are going to happen. And even if they're in the present, it doesn't matter if you've read the series because it doesn't tell you anything interesting. And we have seen on some of the covers of Uncanny X-Men for the fall that Multiple Man might be involved. So maybe this is going to plug into this. Certainly, it seems like Rosenberg's New Mutants Dead Souls is going to plug into it too. But that's it. So I'm sorry I'm going so negative on this one. And it's not even like it's a bad comic book. book, which kind of hurts my feelings to like be negative about an X-Men comic book when it's not bad, but it pushed all the wrong buttons for me in the same way that Mr. and Mrs. X pressed all the right buttons for me. But hopefully I've told you enough about it that if these are your buttons, you do know that you can buy it and enjoy it. Return of Wolverine, #1. He's back, folks. And this issue was written by Charles Soule with pencils from Steve McNiven, inks from Jay Leaston, colors from Laura Martin, letters from Joe Sabino, a main cover by Steve McNiven and Laura Martin, edited by Annalise Bisa, Mark Panaccia, and Jordan White. You don't need any background for this comic book other than Logan died. The end. Goodbye, everybody. So Marvel did this whole Logan is back thing where he had an Infinity Stone and he was popping up in between or in the final pages of all of the different titles in the Marvel Universe. This has nothing to do with that so far anyway, although that might explain how he became undead. We don't know. And then we had 18 issues, 2 one-shots, 2 book-ending one-shots, and 4 four-issue miniseries of The Hunt for Wolverine. And The Hunt found a big old goose egg. It found nothing. It didn't find Wolverine. It told us a little bit about this sinister corporation, not sinister in the Mr. Sinister sense, of this sinister corporation that maybe is very invested in his return, but we didn't really learn anything that informs this too much, even though it certainly does factor into this. And I don't think any of that is required reading. So look, if you've been missing Wolverine since Charles Soule wrote his death in 2014, you can read this issue cold. Maybe you bring up that first Hunt for Wolverine one-shot because it was a pretty interesting story about how the X-Men find out that he's not in his grave anymore, but do not feel like you have to read all that stuff. I read it for you so that I can tell you you don't need to read it, at least not yet. Maybe it's all going to hook into this and we're going to see all those little plot points boil back up to the surface. So what really happens here? Well, it's a very deliberate mirroring of when we find Logan in the Weapon X facility in that famous Weapon X arc by Barry Windsor Smith and Marvel Comics Presents starting in, I believe, issue number 72. We see him kind of awaken in the tank and he fights his way out and he confronts the doctor that put him in there and he has no memories. And he eventually, exits out into the Canadian wilderness in his weird, machine man getup with all these probes and devices affixed to him. This starts not only in a similar place, in a similar way to that, but McNiven, who's usually a really full of detail artist, is not only full of detail here, he is deliberately drawing in the style of Barry Windsor Smith. It's unmistakable. BWS does these faces. They're really wide and they have broad bridges of noses, but they're a little bit tall. It's super, super distinct. And you can tell immediately in this issue that McNiven is tributing him. So Soule has set up the plot to mirror that. The art mirrors that. And also, Wolverine's state mirrors that. He doesn't seem to remember everything, and I'm like, oh, please, 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 let's not go back to Wolverine who can't remember anything, because I read that my whole life up until he started remembering things in the wake of House of M in 2007, and I just don't want to go back all the way back there. But, Soule has a device in this issue where it seems like he's going to gain access to his memories, but it's going to be gradual, and we're going to get a moment with each of these key memories that kind of remind us of how they inform the Logan that we know. So there's an interesting trope here, and Marvel uses it sometimes, everybody uses it, but I tend to like it, where the hero doesn't know they're the hero, but all of the characters around the hero are like, you're the hero, you can handle this. I kind of like that. It's an interesting comment on the public nature of heroism in any particular superhero universe, that even when the hero is brainwashed, it's not complete, or forgets their memories or lobotomized or whatever, it's not completely effective because the public has knowledge of them. They're in the consciousness. So what happens is, he wakes up, he doesn't have memories, he's got to escape somewhere, and of course, as Wolverine tends to do, or, any good Rambo movie, he gets embroiled in the local, politics and the violence happening to the local people, and so rather than really pursue his own justice, he's pursuing justice for the people that surround him, but ultimately it seems like he's probably going to get some of his own justice too. Do I think you need to run out and buy this issue? No, I think it really depends on where Soule takes the plot. And I'm not saying Soule and McNiven, because McNiven is only going to draw issue number 5. Declan Shalvey is going to draw issues 2 through 4, and he has a very, very different art style than McNiven. So we're heading into a second issue with a complete art change-up, and it's hard to know here if this is just going to be an arc where he kind of fights back against this corporation who was holding him for some reason and finds out what they've really been doing with him, because we don't know, or if it's going to blossom into something else for Wolverine. So I urge caution. I don't think this is a run out and buy it. I mean, it had a lot of cool alternate covers or whatever, but I just can't get too excited about it yet. I'm optimistic. I'm ready to see issue number 2. In terms of pre-reading, you could read The Death of Wolverine, but there's no indication you have to know how he died. If anything, I think this is a good time to break out in whatever format you've got it. I've got it in the Wolverine Omnibus right here. You could read it on Marvel Unlimited. It's in a ton of Wolverine collections. The Wolverine Weapon X story by Barry Windsor Smith, because this is mirroring it, and I think if you dive deeply into that original story, you might learn some things that are going to ultimately offer you some insight into the tribute that is being paid to that story in this present-day plot. X-Men Gold, issue number 36, is the final issue of this twice-monthly series that has been running since the resurrection of the X-Men line in 2017. Let's see where we wound up in this issue, number 36, written by Mark Guggenheim, with art from Perry Perez, colors from J. David Ramos, letters from Corey Petit, a cover by Phil Noto, and edited by Chris Robinson, Darren Chan, and Jordan D. White. This issue, much like X-Men Blue 35, if you watched the program last week, is a very kind of one and done, let me summarize what this has all been about sort of issue for you. And it does one of the two things that most comic book series do when they resolve, right? Some series change everything, and none of the toys get put back in the toy box, and everything is different. Other series tend to politely put all the toys back in the state that they found them, and it's sometimes interesting to see which goes one way and which goes the other. A famous one for me is Brian Bendis' run on Avengers. This guy wrote Avengers for 7 years. He did so much with the team, brought so many new characters in, but he still very politely kind of set everybody back on the shelf at the end. He brought back Wasp, he brought back Wonder Man, he brought back Vision. He was there to reinvigorate the franchise and ultimately leave it very open for other people to play with. And that's kind of what it feels like Mark Guggenheim has done with this issue. The characters have all absolutely been through things, but none of them feel like they have been so remarkably altered from where they were at the beginning of the series. And this one-shot issue very much feels like it could be read right after the initial arc of the series, or even before the initial arc of the series, just in terms of the story and the team's actions, although there are some personal interactions inside that refer to the events that have happened in between. So this X-Men Gold title has been about Kitty Pryde kind of being in charge of the X-Men for a while, which is kind of wild to think about. Like, wow, is she the next in line? And then in your head, you're like, Professor X dead, Cyclops dead, Magneto kind of a bad guy, Storm gives up after the whole IVX and Limbo stuff. Are we up to Kitty? Well, I mean, Rogue's leading the Uncanny Avengers at that time. Beast can't be trusted. Warren Worthington is always in the process of being wiped into a blank slate. Iceman is dealing with his coming to terms with his sexuality. If you tick right down the list of people in order that they joined X-Men in seniority, you get to Kitty Pryde. There's not a whole lot of other people that are still around that have leadership potential that are higher than her. But so she takes over this team, and her leadership is very much influenced by what she saw Cyclops do in Astonishing X-Men by Joss Whedon in the mid-2000s. He put together this very PR team. We have to astonish them, right? And so, they tried to go out and deal with non-mutant problems, but it turned out to be mutant problems anyway. Aw shucks. And then they wind up having mutant problems for the whole book, but he had good intent. And this book very much mirrors that journey. Kitty goes out in the first arc. She's like, we're going to take down Terrax because that's the thing we should do. Take down random alien former heralds as they try to destroy New York City. But then over the course of the book, it becomes very much about X-Men problems. Although Guggenheim, to his credit, tried to do some non-mutant-y stuff with an alternate reality thing, or alternate dimension thing. It wasn't great, but at least he tried, right? So if you were watching some This Week in X's from me earlier this year, you know that I didn't really love X-Men Gold, and I still can't say that I did. But this issue actually leaves me feeling kind of nostalgic for what could have been with this series in terms of it being an X-Men team to astonish them. When we see these characters interacting, when we see them just responding in this issue to this mutant who has, manifested his powers, he has no control, and, it's either get the powers under control or see him be killed. The team springs into action, and they're all completely selfless in different ways. Kitty draws the hardest line here, and some of her compatriots are surprised and, in fact, actually deny going as far as she wants to go to protect this mutant. But it says a lot about these characters, and it says a lot about how the X-Men want themselves to be viewed in this world. But even in a world where they're fighting, being hated and feared, there's still a spectrum of responses to that within the team, ranging from anger to compassion. Now, this does also acknowledge a lot of things that have happened. Kitty Pryde and Colossus ultimately didn't get married, and she's trying to call his voicemail just to hear the sound of his voice. Kurt, Nightcrawler, and Rachel Gray Summers, who what are we calling her now? Prestige, briefly were in a relationship, and then Rachel decides to break it off, and we see them still being teammates. Storm had her own hammer and kind of turned into a Thor, but then had to use up all of it to fight off an evil god back in her home village in Africa. So and Rachel, actually, in addition to breaking it off with Nightcrawler, was tempted to go back down the path of being a hound, and, barely resists after being in a mental battle with Mesmero for like half of the issues of the series. So a lot of things have happened to these characters, and this issue at once feels like it could have just been at the beginning, but it's here at the end, and it kind of puts them all back. Even though all these things happen, if you look at the status quo, it's all been reset, right? Kitty is single and, the leader of the X-Men again. Colossus is kind of off being a weird Russian with a beard. Nightcrawler is happy to be supporting his fellow mutants. Rachel is kind of reset back to her status quo. Storm doesn't have her, God hammer powers. They're all gently put back on the shelf. And that's fine. So here's my thing. If you haven't been reading Gold all along, there's no reason really to read it that we know of, although who knows, some of these plot threads will get picked up. But if you want to get a sense of what Gold was about, pick up this issue. It's a fine issue, it looks good, it's written well, it's pretty on voice, and it kind of tells you all you need to know. Or maybe pick up issue 30, which was the wedding, and this issue. That's like a nice abridged version of X-Men Gold. I don't know that you need too much else. But it's not required reading. It doesn't resolve anything we've been dying to have resolved from this series. It doesn't really give us a jumping off, and all the tombstones on the cover are complete head fake. There's no need to focus on tombstones in this issue. So, Gold, it was nice to know you, and sorry that you didn't survive the experience, but there are some good things in this series, I'm willing to admit, and I think ultimately it's going to go down as being known as the Kitty Pryde X-Men series. She's been a supporting player many, many times in the past, but I feel like this really feels like the X-Men run that features Kitty Pryde, other than astonishing, and for that, there might be some people who want to go back and experience it over again. Also this week in Marvel Comics, Quentin Quire, one of the X-Men from the X-Men Academy who originated in Grant Morrison's new X-Men run, is a regular cast member in West Coast Avengers, and we have the second issue of that out this week. It's by Kelly Thompson, so I think you can guess how much I liked it. I'm not going to recap it here on the show unless we get an arc that's solely focused on Quire, but he does have some very amusing moments in this issue, and I definitely really, really liked it. Also out this week is one X-Men collection from Marvel. It is Cable Volume 3. It is titled Past Fears. It contains that third arc of Cable, which was written by Zach Thompson and Lonnie Nadler, and we only covered one issue of it here on This Week in X earlier this year, but I've read it all, and I'm here to tell you it's really, really good. It's the best I think that Cable's been written in a long time, and if you didn't get to read it in single issues earlier this year, I think it's a great chance to read it if you like things about Cable's past and how he came to be the Cable we know today, and all the things that have haunted him along the way, but also a little bit of his relationship with Hope Summers. Also, FYI, it's not strictly X-Men, but there is a new collection of Alan Davis's mid-2000s Clandestine series out this week, and it also has in it a series of annuals that were all by Alan Davis from right around the beginning of Marvel Now that actually were a linked Clandestine story across 3 other characters. So you can pick that up if you want some beautiful Alan Davis artwork, and if you want to see a team that he pretty much created as his own spin-off team off of Excalibur. That was This Week in X, covering all of the X-Men comic books out from Marvel this week. If you have enjoyed this fine program, I would love it if you would like it, subscribe it, and share it. That not only tells me that you liked it, but it lets other people know that it's something worth watching, and I love it when you talk to me about it. So get at me in the comments below, on Twitter, anywhere that you'd like to continue the conversation about X-Men comic books out this week. And I just have to say that all this is made possible, the video, the sound, all of these things, by my supporters on Patreon. They're the ones who keep Crushing Crisis and all of its Crushing Comics comic book collecting guides afloat month after month. I'm so appreciative of them, and that is how my comics world goes round. So thank you to all of my patrons. Thank you to everybody listening and watching. This has been This Week in X, presented to you by Crushing Comics.